One of Jorge Luis Borges' most haunting stories is the short Library of Babel, which begins from the vantage point of somebody explaining the universe in which he lives, one that's rather not only imaginative and perhaps even macabre in certain respects, but also leaves a lot of questions open. How did they get there? How is it possible that they have language that they use outside of these books? There's a number of different questions that are left not even unanswered, but unasked. And we may get to some of those in a bit. But what's really important is to think about what this tells us about language, about the nature of the universe, reality, as a sort of model, you might say, that can be analogized in different ways. And so we step into this narrative universe on the very first line. The universe, which others call the library, is composed of an indefinite, perhaps infinite number of hexagonal galleries. In the center of each gallery is a ventilation shaft bounded by a low ceiling. From any hexagon, one can see the floors above and below, one after another, endlessly. The arrangement of the galleries is always the same. So we're going to find out the topography of this infinite location. 20 bookshelves. So each hexagon contains 5 on each side of 4 of the sides of the hexagon. Then there's 2 doorways, or you could say free sides, that open up. One of them opens up into a narrow sort of vestibule, which in turn opens onto another gallery, identical to the first, identical in fact to all. To the left and right of the vestibule are 2 tiny compartments, one for sleeping, the other for satisfying one's physical necessities. Through this space, too, there passes a spiral staircase, which winds upward and downward into the remotest distance. In the vestibule is a mirror which faithfully duplicates appearances. And then there's spherical fruits that bear the name bulbs. There's 2 of these bulbs in each hexagon set crosswise. The light they give is insufficient and unceasing. So there we get a description. Now you might say, well, where do they actually get their food? We don't know. It's not one of those stories. It's just outlining the key aspects that the narrator wants to put in front of us. Now, each of these walls, the 4 walls in each hexagon, contains 5 bookshelves. And we read each bookshelf, then holds 32 books identical in format. Okay, so we've got quite a few already. Each book contains 410 pages, each page 40 lines, each line approximately 80 black letters. There's also letters on the front cover of each book. These letters don't indicate or prefigure what the pages inside will say. So we've got this vast library just chock full of books. For some of us, this may actually sound like, as Borges has said elsewhere, heaven I picture as a library, right? But not this library, perhaps, for reasons that we'll talk about. Now, what's the issue here? So the books and their pages and their lines and their letters are mostly, at least seemingly, nonsense. Just combinations of possible letters. So now we get to the interpretation. And we're looking mostly at the orthodox ideas about the library because the narrator presents himself as being among those. And he says that we have some axioms. First, the library has existed ab aeternitate. What does that mean? From eternity. So there's always been this library even before there were human beings. And he says that truth whose immediate corollary is the future eternity of the world, no rational mind can doubt. Man, the imperfect librarian, could be the work of chance or malevolent demiurges. But the universe, with its elegant appointments, its bookshelves, its enigmatic books, its indefatigable staircases for the traveler, and its water closets for the seated librarian, that can only be the handiwork of a god. Now, isn't it funny that, in a way, he's denying it by calling it the handiwork of a god, that it would be eternal, because handiwork comes into being at a certain time. But perhaps there's ways around that. He moves on from there to the second axiom. And what is this? Well, we're going to find out that this was realized later on, and now it's accepted by everyone. There are 25 orthographic symbols. That discovery enabled mankind 300 years ago to formulate a general theory of the library and thereby satisfactorily solve the riddle that no conjecture had been able to divine. What is that? The formless and chaotic nature of virtually all books. So we should pause on that for a moment. It turns out that most of the books that they pour through and check out don't contain anything that really makes sense. He says, one book which my father once saw in a hexagon consisted of the letters MCV perversely repeated from the first line to the last. Another, much consulted in this zone, is a mere labyrinth of letters whose penultimate page contains the phrase, "O time thy pyramids." This much is known. For every rational line or forthright statement, there are leagues. A league is 3 miles, so miles and miles of senseless cacophony, verbal nonsense, and incoherency. So most of the books don't actually contain anything that seems to have meaning to it. And, like he says, for many years it was believed those impenetrable books were in ancient or far distant languages. It's true the most ancient peoples, the first librarians, employed a language quite different from the one we speak today. It's also true that a few miles to the right our language devolves into dialect, and that 90 floor above it becomes incomprehensible. All that is true, but 410 pages of unvarying MCVs cannot belong to any language, however dialectical or primitive it may be. And there's, people who have suggestions for interpreting this. We'll pass on from that. Eventually in the story, we come to find out about this brilliant librarian who formulated a fundamental law. Right? Now, what exactly is the fundamental law? It's not entirely clear. It could be 2 different propositions that are given here. So let's just read this. So they discover one book that contains almost 2 pages of homogeneous lines, and people kind of differ. The experts are trying to determine what language it is. Some suggest Portuguese, some suggest Yiddish. Some say it's a Samoyed Lithuanian dialect of Guarani with inflections from classical Arabic. And the content was determined, rudiments of combinatory analysis, illustrated with examples of endlessly repeating variations. Now you could say, how in the hell did you figure that out? There must be references to these languages, and we don't get an answer there. So there's a bit of fancifulness in this, and perhaps the suggestion that this could be an unreliable narrator. But this brilliant librarian, a librarian of genius, discovers the fundamental law of the library. And so Borges doesn't come right out and say what the law is. He tells us the reasoning process. This philosopher observed that all books, however different from one another they might be, consist of identical elements: the space, the period, the comma, and the 22 letters of the alphabet. He also posited a fact which all travelers have since confirmed. in all the library, there are no two identical books. Now, could travelers actually confirm that? No, this has to be a postulate. From these incontrovertible premises, the librarian deduced that the library is total, perfect, complete, and whole, and that its bookshelves contain all possible combinations of the 22 orthographic symbols, a number which, though unimaginably vast, is not infinite. That is all that is able to be expressed in every language. So that looks like it's probably the law, this conclusion, but we should know, no two identical volumes. That's an important axiom, conclusion, whatever we want to call it as well. So if the library actually does contain every single possible combination for 410 pages of 40 lines of 80 letters, then it should contain any book that we can think of. Well, longer books maybe can't have that. Maybe they'd have to be like, volume 1, volume 2, volume 3. But anything that we could think of that can be expressed in any language should be in the library somewhere. Difficult to find, of course, because you're sifting among infinite possibilities and you only have finite time to go through and read these books, right? So it's a very interesting idea, and there are some really important implications for the people of the library for that. So one of these is that there would be books that refer to and explain or comment on or justify certain matters, actually every matter. So what are some examples? The detailed history of the future, the autobiographies of the archangels, the faithful catalog of the library. Now, could that actually fit in one book? Probably not. Thousands and thousands of false catalogs. Ooh, there's a problem there. The commentary, here we go. A proof of the falsity of the true catalog, the Gnostic Gospel of Basilides, the commentary upon that gospel, the commentary on that gospel. Well, now we're getting kind of in the weeds. Here we get to something that might be of more interest, the true story of your death, the translation of every book into every language, the interpolations of every book into all books, the treatise Bede, that's the Venerable Bede, a historian of Anglo-Saxon Britain, could have written but did not on the mythology of the Saxon people, the lost books of Tacitus. As a matter of fact, every lost book should be in the library, shouldn't it? And we find that there's a special kind of book as well. People found themselves the possessors of an intact and secret treasure. There was no personal problem, no world problem whose eloquent solution did not exist somewhere in that hexagon. And at that point, there was much talk of the vindications, books of apologiae, that is justifications, and prophecies that would vindicate for all time the actions of every person in the universe and held wondrous arcana for men's futures. So you could find a book that told you everything you need to know about yourself and why your life had meaning, right? He talks a little bit later about books that could explain fundamental mysteries for us human beings. The origin of the library and of time, right? And he says, in all likelihood, those profound mysteries can indeed be explained in words. If the language of the philosophers is not sufficient, then the library must have produced the extraordinary language required together with the words and grammar of that very language. So you should be able to find a teach yourself library-ese that would allow you to become fluent in the language in which all of these mysteries could in fact be explained, argued for, revealed. So This is quite a picture. Going on a little bit further, there's a few other things that the narrator is going to assert that are quite important for understanding this, labyrinth of language that is the library and is their universe. So he is actually going to say that there is no nonsense in the books of the library. Why? He says that everyone is susceptible to cryptographic or allegorical reading. Reading, that justification of the words, orders, and existence is verbal and already contained in the library. There is no combination that the divine library is not foreseen and that in one or more of its secret tongues does not hide a terrible significance. And he gives a few examples of possibilities. There's no syllable one can speak that's not filled with tenderness and terror. There is not in one of those languages the mighty name of a god. To speak is to commit tautologies. So he goes on and he's going to say that the library was here before human beings. Human beings are in decline in this story for reasons we'll talk about elsewhere. And he suggests that perhaps after the human species is extinct, the library will endure. And he's got a bunch of, let's call them qualifiers, adjectives, but really this is kind of akin to a litany of the names of God. Enlightened, solitary, infinite, perfectly unmoving, armed with precious volumes, pointless, incorruptible, and secret. So the library has all of these qualities that we are attributing to it. And he also finishes by talking about the infinity of the library. He says, I've written the word infinite. I've not included that adjective out of mere rhetorical habit. I state it is not illogical to think that the world is infinite. Those who believe it to have limits hypothesize that in some remote place or places the corridors and staircases and hexagons may inconceivably end, which is absurd. And yet those who picture the world as unlimited forget that the number of possible books is not. So maybe we have different levels of infinity here. So he goes on and he says, I suggest this solution to the ancient problem. The library is unlimited, but periodic. If an eternal traveler should journey in any direction, he would find after untold centuries the same volumes are repeated in the same disorder, which repeated becomes order, the order in capitals. And that's where the story is going to end for us. All of these are sort of conjectures made by humans within this vast space that they can think about, they can imagine, but they can't possibly experience. And in a certain way, we could say that this is, a metaphor for multiple things, for the infinite capacity of language through combinations of things, to express, to refer, to engage in all sorts of linguistic and intellectual acts on the one hand, and on the other hand, how it is that we human beings make sense of this cosmos of which we only see the smallest little bit. Perhaps it's chaos, perhaps it's order, perhaps it's randomness, perhaps it is design. Do we know? So those are some of the interesting implications of this story, The Library of Babel.